sound, which means it's officially time to start, I think. So thank you, Shannon, for starting the recording. And welcome everyone to today's webinar. We are going to talk about decarbonizing school buildings today, the Building Electrification Technology Roadmap. And we have some great panelists that are going to present today. So we'll go ahead and jump in. We've got a full agenda. But first, I wanted to let everyone know that this webinar was developed in partnership with the San Diego Learn program. The Learn program is a San Diego-based workforce education and training program that is partnered with New Buildings Institute and the Advanced Water Heating Initiative, AWHI, to offer free energy efficiency and electrification webinars. You can visit the Learn website for more information at www.sandiegolearn.com. And that is where the slides will be posted after this event as well, the recording and the slides. So before you ask, this recording and slides will be available. So today we have 4 presenters, very excited to share. We have Riley Levin-Falvey from New Buildings Institute, Reese Davis from Resource Refocus, Shannon Oliver from New Buildings Institute, and Chamberlain Segrist from Sacramento City Unified School District. And my name is Misha Egolf. I'm also with New Buildings Institute, and I'm the moderator for this session today. So a little bit about New Buildings Institute, since there's a few of us presenting today from NBI. We are a nonprofit. We push for better buildings that achieve zero energy, zero carbon, and beyond. We are generally based in Portland, Oregon, but we've got staff all over the place. I'm in Washington, Shannon's in Colorado, and Riley's in Portland area. So we've got the schools team representing here today, and then I'm also part of our building innovation team. So I'm going to keep it short and sweet and let the presenters introduce themselves as we go along here. And if you do have questions that come up throughout the presentations, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A. I also see that folks are already active in the chat, which is great. Feel free to chat with each other or us through the chat. But if you do have questions that you would like us to answer at the end, we are going to hold questions until the end. Go ahead and pop them in there, and we'll have them in the queue to talk about with the full group. So with that, Riley, I will hand it off to you to kick us off and talk about why we are here today.
Thanks, Misha. And like I said in the chat, I see a lot of friends in the room, so it's nice to see y'all. I always feel a little silly introducing myself when I know most of the people, but for anyone that's new, I'm Riley. I'm an associate director here at New Buildings Institute. I've been working in schools for like 15 years at this point in the kind of like sustainability, energy efficiency world. So I've actually lived in California and worked in schools, but then I also lived on the West Coast. And like Misha said, our schools team is here represented, and we actually cross the whole country in our sort of like schools expertise. So this is always my spiel. So I'm sorry if I tell stories or get on my soapbox. It's what happens. But there are just so many reasons to care about energy and carbon in schools, because focusing on efficiency saves money that goes back into the classroom or helps address deferred maintenance. It creates these like brighter, healthier, and breathable spaces, and it reduces harmful carbon emissions that are rapidly changing our natural world. I imagine everyone in this room has seen some aspect of that, even just in the last couple of weeks, if not beyond that. California's K-12 schools, as you can see here, emit an estimated 1 million metric tons of emissions annually. It's a lot of M's in that sentence. And this is, by the way, operational carbon. I want to make that real clear, because that doesn't take into effect things like transportation, transmission, procurement. There's like different scopes of emissions. So this is just like the lights on in your room, the HVAC system, it's the operational carbon. So there's even more emissions happening. But to put that number into perspective, because a number is just a number until we make it relative, that is 4 natural gas-fired power plants for a year, or, this is my favorite one, 4 billion miles driven by the average gas car. And so imagine the impact we could make if we address, this is just the K-12 building stock. There are tons of other buildings that play into this here, but the K-12 building stock can make such a huge impact. Next slide. And what really contributes to these emissions is the choice of fuel in our buildings. Fossil fuel burning equipment on site is the greatest contributor to emissions. You can see some photos here. As you can see, big credit to our friend Nick, who was formerly of San Francisco Unified. He always used to joke that this was the system they put the bad children into. So, I'm sure we can all relate to that. These are commonly found in things like space heating. So the emissions generators are commonly found in space heating, water heating, and things like kitchen equipment. Next slide. And so to minimize the impact that our schools are having on the world, transitioning away from those fossil fuels and those systems that I just showed you to all electric systems will help drive down emissions. So an all electric school, like our lovely graphic here, has no on-site combustion. So we see things like heat pump water heaters or an all electric kitchen, among many other things, because there are other notable components that you can see in this graphic here. And in a perfect world, an all electric school will also implement things like energy efficiency measures like a reflective roof, energy efficient windows, LED lighting to decrease the overall energy needs of the building, and a whole suite of things. And because emissions can also come from electricity, if the energy grid is using gas or coal-fired equipment to generate the electricity, this also makes the case for not just transitioning away from fossil fuel, but also making sure to utilize really efficient systems and practices. And we recommend that sort of to begin this process, you take the first step, or schools take the first step, or if you're a designer, you help the schools take the first step of assessing overall use and begin to think about how you might implement some of these measures to transition to those all electric mechanical systems. Because once systems are transitioned and your overall load is determined, then you can start to use things like on-site solar and storage to help keep those operating costs down, which you can also see in this cute little graphic. And obviously, we are like, yay, shiny new systems. We're so excited about them, all electric, but efficiency is like so critical here, and efficiency matters because the efficiency of the electric equipment you choose like really matters here. So like while an electric resistance water heater is technically electric, the efficiency is barely better than a gas-fired water heater. So your overall load then remains the same, which actually can cost you more in the long run, because I know, especially in California, electricity is not necessarily that cheap. So it's super important to drive down your energy use overall too. So, and another thing to consider as you think about that electric equipment transition and the options is that it's really important to consider the controllability of the equipment. So you can participate in things like, or you can help districts participate in utility programs that will help keep your operating costs down. And California has some great options. Let's go to the next slide. So achieving an all-electric school, especially in those existing older schools, can feel like such a daunting task. That is like daunting with all capital letters, like truly daunting. Because I'm, for example, doing the same thing in my home, and some days I just feel like it will never happen. But the key here is to think about it as a process over time. We call it the getting to zero over time approach, which is a long-term strategic approach to energy management, where you are using you leverage every naturally occurring opportunity in the building life cycle to drive down those energy and emissions. And these naturally occurring opportunities could be anything from like a roof replacement, equipment reaching end of useful life, a major or a minor retrofit project, or it can even be something a little bit more abstract like school board turnover. Those are really important moments in time where you can use new momentum to drive energy and efficiency. And the key point in this sort of like great concept here is that it's not a program to follow. I know there's tons of like programs and campaigns and things out there. This is like your own, it's updating plans and processes to include energy and carbon, and then using those to guide you as opportunities and funding arise. So it is your internal processes so that you're ultimately achieving an all electric or carbon neutral district in a way that is cost effective, creates less disruption and displacement of students, which is like paramount priority number one, and aligns with broader district goals and plans. And this process, so the graphic on the right here, is guided by setting those goals early and referring back to them at every opportunity and incorporating them in those guidance documents. So you can see here on this little graphic, just some broader goals of carbon neutral by 2045 and that little cute circle at the top, which is, we put that in here because that's the executive order in California. And then you can see there are also some milestones to get there along the way so that you're constantly evaluating if what you're doing is working you towards that goal. And then what's not pictured here is you can also set more specific goals for each building lifecycle opportunity. Like ultimately new construction is your greatest opportunity for electrification because you are given like a blank slate versus a modernization or a retrofit, so you can have specific goals for different lifecycle events. Next slide. Oh, so good, so quick. NBI has created a guide and a suite of resources and templates to guide you through this getting to zero over time process, all the way from engaging stakeholders to implementation and reporting on progress. And one thing to note, which I love to say here, is that these aren't necessarily in the same order you might approach them. These are the common actions taken. So you might approach them differently, and that is great because every district has different priorities, different communities, and different needs. So like we have known districts that set goals first and then engage stakeholders, or some roundabout way of doing it. So if you're a little unclear of where to start, we're super happy to help. Feel free to reach out if you need additional support instead of just this piece of paper here, but it is a really helpful guide. Next slide. The decarbonization roadmap guide is a great starting point, but the information today that we are covering is about the building electrification technology roadmap better for schools project. And the goal of this report is to provide this high-level guidance for school districts who are considering electrifying school buildings. And this document includes a cost analysis of electric technologies that can replace traditional equipment used commonly in schools for a variety of opportunities in those building life cycles that I was talking about. And this report also includes an interactive cost estimation tool on our website, which is on the link there, or there was a link there at one point. We'll get you the link in the chat. That basically takes the information in the report and puts it into this great, easy to use dashboard. And they'll talk about it a little bit later. Next slide. So in this report, we categorize electrification projects into 4 different scenarios to align with greater events in the building life cycle. If any of you on this call are from a school district or have worked with a school district, these will feel very familiar to you. And each of these scenarios has a different goal, which will then dictate the most appropriate equipment in that moment. So for example, as you can see on the screen, we've got emergency replacement right at the top. I swear, every time I see those words together, my heart has a little palpitation. And the goal of this life cycle event, this emergency replacement, is to have minimal upfront costs. And we said this was a goal. We realize in some cases that might not be actuality. Also would have non-invasive or non-disruptive installation, and then have equipment just ready to plug in and roll. Whereas something like a planned or routine capital improvement has similar goals, but focuses more on having lead time and proper planning for improved air quality and efficiency. Next slide. And we know more than anyone, we obviously recognize that things happen, they happen fast, that can be very abrupt and disruptive. You know, heating goes down in the middle of winter, an oven suddenly decides it's just had enough. Emergency replacement is one of the scenarios that is least conducive to electrification and cost effectiveness. But using that getting to zero over time approach, this is me bringing it back here, is creates the process of just being proactive and being ready for when something happens. Or it intervenes before it does and helps us avoid those emergency replacement scenarios, so it goes into one of the other scenarios. So I have given you all this quick overview of why we are even here online talking to you all today, and some considerations for electrification in schools. So I'm going to now pass the mic off to Reese from Resource Refocus, who is our partner on this report, who's going to dive a little deeper into the technologies and the processes for incorporating this into your plans and practices. Reese,
Awesome.
take it away.
Thanks, Riley. I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm Reese Davis, a technical consultant at Resource Refocus. We do, we provide expertise in building science, decarbonization planning, and policy analysis, and we're very lucky to support NBI in this work. So we can jump in. So the end uses that we looked at in this kind of study and analysis of electrification in schools were space heating, water heating, kitchens, laundry, and transportation. There are a handful of other end uses that you might see in some niche applications in schools that still use gas or fossil fuel equipment, but these are kind of the biggest chunks of the emissions pie that we wanted to look at. So before we can really, recommend or evaluate electrification solutions, we need to kind of think about what scenarios they are kind of applicable in and what additional information we might need to know about them. So as Riley mentioned, obviously some equipment is going to be feasible in emergency replacements, and some, larger HVAC equipment, larger HVAC heat pump applications are just, it's not something that you can do in a, 24-hour period. You need a lot of design and planning. And so there's some electrification technology that just isn't, feasible to go in an emergency replacement, but in an optimal scenario and a deep efficiency retrofit with lead time, can provide good outcomes. And obviously different building sizes and types within schools are going to have different electrification solutions. So, a modular school building is not going to have the same, same kind of heat pump system that a large high school with a big auditorium, a commercial kitchen is going to have. So that's something we want to consider when we're thinking about the different options available. Obviously, a big driver and barrier sometimes to electrification is upfront cost, and that's both, knowing what the incremental cost is above the baseline gas system, and also just the kind of risk in determining that cost, because there can be a pretty big range that has a high end, especially if it's not planned for adequately. So, we want to try to address what the cost of equipment is, but also what the cost of, potentially needing to upgrade the electrical systems and infrastructure, and what additional like mechanical work may need to be done. So that's something we've tried to capture when evaluating these electrification technologies. Obviously, utility costs are also going to be a potential driver for electrification if we can keep them lower than the kind of fossil fuel baseline costs. But that is something that's hard to determine without doing a full kind of custom energy modeling comparison between a baseline and a few different electrification options. So in our report, we tried to kind of qualitatively evaluate different electrification solutions in terms of how they would impact utility costs. But in general, we recommend, really diving into what the performance benefits would be of different electrification solutions in your own building design. There are obviously going to be different installation, different levels of installation difficulties depending on what you're installing. A very basic stovetop or just countertop induction stove, you don't really need to think too much about that installation, but a full commercial kitchen overhaul electrification project is going to require some additional equipment, training and whatnot. So there's definitely, things that we want to include in our report that get at that. And obviously emissions impacts are going to vary. As Riley noted, an electric resistance water heater is technically electrification, but may actually not provide any greenhouse gas emissions impacts or any energy reduction. So that's something we tried to capture in our study. And then also, electrification does not inherently improve air quality in a building, except for when you're actually removing direct combustion from indoor spaces, like in gas stoves replaced with electric stoves. But there are ways to kind of tie air quality improvement to electrification retrofits and vice versa. So there's some good co-benefits there that can help move a project along. So we can move to the next slide. So in some of those installation considerations I mentioned, one of the biggest and kind of most upfront ones that you want to plan for is thinking about whether the electrical infrastructure will need to be upsized. That's panels, sub-panels, wiring, and even distribution transformer. And there's some end uses that you can probably assume will require some of that upsizing. Like if you put in a large electric vehicle charging station, you can probably guess you'll need new panels and possibly, to possibly do a load analysis for the distribution transformers. But in some smaller applications and modular classrooms, you may be able to get away with just installing a heat pump HVAC system without doing much upsizing. But that's where the planning comes in. Knowing that beforehand can really improve the likelihood of a successful electrification project. And you also just want to look at, what other tangential systems are going to need to be upgraded or at least, taken out, demolished, or just retrofitted. That's, piping, VAV boxes, ducts. And one other thing we've seen as kind of a big time barrier to these electrification and decarbonization projects is, is there an architect's review or kind of other outside third-party review required? If you're putting large HVAC equipment on roofs that wasn't there before, or if you're adding solar onto a roof, you're often going to have to do some sort of structural analysis review. So that's something to plan for. And again, just goes back into really thinking about these retrofits ahead of time, because without doing so, you can have really long lead times and can sometimes, make the project fall apart. But yeah, we can move to the next slide. I talked about the operational considerations. Obviously, we can't just, it's hard to compare just a heat pump to a gas furnace without looking more at the insulation of the building and other, attributional qualities of the building. But we can recommend, doing custom hourly energy modeling to look at the performance of different systems, the baseline system, and really picking the optimal design solution for your building, and having that ready to go before you do any other work in terms of load analyses and starting to procure equipment and funding. But for our study, we did just kind of qualitatively estimate the impacts of these technologies relative to each other and to the existing systems. Next slide. And yeah, air quality. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but just existing school buildings right now often don't provide sufficient air quality. And that's something that we really want to have electrification retrofits be able to address. So there's some electrification solutions that, get right to this, like indoor gas combustion being replaced by electric options like induction stoves and electric cooking equipment. That's an easy air quality improvement measure. But heat pumps and heat pump water heaters alone don't necessarily improve indoor air quality, but when overhauling an HVAC system, it makes sense to also replace the ventilation system with something like a dedicated outdoor air system that provides 100% outdoor air and improves ventilation in a building. So that's just something that we kind of get into in that report and talk about some of those co-benefits that can be brought about with electrification. And just we want to highlight that for all of the different baseline gas systems that you might see, and here's an example for HVAC. You might have ducted heating, ductless heating, central boiler heating of all different kinds of sizes. There is an electrification solution. Admittedly, there are some gaps in the larger central applications, and maybe gaps is not the right word, but you require more custom solutions. So when you're getting into some of the water source and ground source heat pumped, larger heat pump applications, to replace your central boiler, it just requires a little bit more custom design work, but can really produce some optimal solutions. So we can move to the next slide. So putting this all together in the report we put together, there are matrices that kind of highlight all of these different considerations. We can move to the next slide. For each electrification technology, you can see on the left there, we've kind of categorized and characterized them based on what we have seen in real world data about cost ranges. And obviously these are subject to the size of the building and the design of the layout and capacity needed. But, we want to provide a kind of range of costs, and then also what scenarios and building types they're more appropriate for, and what we think the utility cost impact will be based on their system efficiencies. And then, getting into the benefits and impacts I talked about earlier, just ease of maintenance, ease of install, indoor air quality potential, and greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And then one other thing to think about with heat pumps is there a low global warming potential or refrigerant option? And that's one way to, kind of lower the greenhouse gas emissions impact over the life cycle of this equipment. Can move to the next slide. The next one's just showing that we have one for water heating as well. I will let you all go to the report to look at these more in depth. I know there's a lot of content on this slide, so we can move to the next slide. So last thing here, I think Riley drove this home, but I'll continue to drive it home. Just make a plan. I think the more modeling you can do beforehand, and then the more consideration about panel and distribution transformer upgrades and any third-party reviews is going to make this project, these electrification retrofits be a lot more likely. And really, anytime you can do any readiness measures, like, you don't have funding for the full, HVAC retrofit, but you're going to be needing to put in new wiring right now anyway. So maybe you just upsize the size of the panels or wires that you put in, and just kind of stage some of these projects. HVAC is always going to have the biggest impact, both cost-wise and, potential benefits to utility costs and air quality impacts. So that's definitely the one you want to spend a lot of time and planning on. Heat pumps, always choose heat pumps where you can. They're a really marvel of technology that, is really always going to be the most efficient and cleanest option. Low global warming potential refrigerants where possible, Energy Star appliances where possible. And then just again, I think there's a lot of co-benefits here, especially when we're retrofitting an HVAC system with an electrification option. Look to where you can improve air quality, and vice versa. If you're doing an air quality project, see if you can make that electric. I think, pretty much in every situation, it's very possible. So I'm gonna kick it over to Shannon to talk about some of the decisions around this.
Nice, thanks, Reese. Yeah, hey everyone, Shannon Oliver here again, Senior Project Manager at New Buildings Institute. I joined the organization, I guess would be October of 2023, so not quite a year ago. And prior to that, I was an energy and sustainability manager for a school district here where I live in Colorado. And so I kind of bring that sort of firsthand experience, and gonna sort of step out of the awesome technical and cost data that you can find within the BETR report, to help you think about how to make some decisions in this space. Because as we all know, school districts are organizations are ran by people, and people have sort of default behaviors and levels of knowledge about this equipment, which can really impact, whether or not you're able to kind of move forward with the project. So yeah, jumping right in. As I said, decisions are made by people, right? You have to kind of think about this idea of this curve here. It's kind of a common concept within behavioral health. The diffusion of innovation is as a decision-making model, right? Are you going to make a change based on kind of your level of knowledge and your just general personal aptitude to change, right? So those innovators, right, are the ones out waiting in line maybe for the next iPhone overnight, right? Versus the laggards who still maybe have it like a slider phone or a flip phone. And there's a variety of reasons why those individuals are in those spaces. So again, as you're beginning to plan for these types of electrification projects in your school or your district, you kind of need to think about the district as a whole, right? Is it a very risk averse district, or is it out trying new things? Has it committed to carbon goals or other goals that are going to help promote this work? Right. And you also need to think about where some of those individuals are, particularly the leadership, the decision-making role folks that might be involved in a project like this, right? Is it your construction managers or your facility folks that are setting your technical guidelines and specifications? Or is it going to go all the way up to superintendent and school board level? And then you got to think about what motivates them, right? There's another sort of concept that I've read about, called head, heart, or wallet, right? Folks are oftentimes motivated towards change based on where they see the value, right? The head might be that economic decision, right? It's probably going to frequently be, I guess that would be wallet. Wallet would be the economic decision. Head is sort of, it makes sense, right? There's a variety of reasons. Maybe it's the most logical path forward. Maybe there's additional benefit they can see from the project. Beyond just economic, right? They feel as though it's going to improve, maybe the learning environment for their students, and that makes sense because ultimately the outcomes we want are, better test scores, better graduation rates, or it might be heart, right? They do as an individual, care about the planet. They maybe are concerned about climate change, and so they really want to do this work for those environmental benefits. So when you're beginning, ideally, a planning process, again, let's try to avoid those emergency replacement projects, and get some planning earlier on. Try to step back and think about the folks you're working with and where they are and how you might help them move from, from that sort of laggard late majority towards more of a early majority or adopter side of things. So we go to the next slide. And this is sort of really highlighted by how districts allocate their general fund budget, and the way in which districts are able to fund the capital improvements. So this is just a quick snippet of data specific to Colorado schools kind of averages for the Denver Metro and statewide average. I use this data because I'm familiar with it, but you can kind of find similar numbers for other states or the nation. And really the take home message here is that little sort of brown chunk of the pie is what is spent on operations. And it's fairly, it's not the smallest, but if you think about everything else kind of being staff and staff capacity and instructional, right, it falls way behind in the sort of percentage of funding that is available for the things you want to do. And once you start looking at capital budgets in relation to a bond, you're going to see a bit more spent towards that operational side, right? Facility improvements. But oftentimes a lot of that may go to operational things that are not energy and facility related. It might be, IT upgrades. It might be educational improvements in the classrooms. It might be security things such as camera and secure vestibules, which can have an impact on energy, but aren't really where the focus is when you're trying to do these electrification projects. So again, you really need to prioritize those conversations and have a good story to tell of why this work is important for your district, given these constraints. And that's kind of where the better report comes in. It's going to allow you to look at sort of some example projects that you might consider with some kind of relative, cost comparison and expense comparison. And we got one example here on the next slide of a, utilizing some of the federal funds. So this is a large school HVAC replacement, right? Pretty standard centralized boiler, centralized chiller, fed to air handling units and VAVs. And you're going to maybe move towards a multi-zone airside heat pump with some VRF and DOAS with an ERV approach because of the various components that sort of require that. Maybe you don't have space for a ground source heat pump, or maybe you're able to reutilize a lot of the ducting in this sort of scenario, ducting and piping to save some cost here. So again, as was mentioned earlier, this electrification of the system, probably isn't going to cost you less, and it may not exactly save you a ton of energy over time to the standpoint of having payback in a traditional sense. So you got to get a little bit creative in order to figure out whether or not this is going to pencil out for your district. So we have these kind of rough replacement costs on that first line there, and then some kind of proposed electrification costs, quite a bit more, right, than the existing replacement costs. But again, maybe try to focus on just that incremental piece, because you're going to have to replace the existing system regardless. So that that 800,000 to 1.5 million is going to be spent independent of what you do. So really focus on that incremental cost and see how you might lower that value to maybe get closer to a payback or a number that your district is willing to go for. So in this case, we looked at the 179D deduction, and if you're not familiar, this is a tax deduction that your general contractor, architect, energy services company, whoever is sort of running the project for you, they can receive this as a for-profit company on their tax burden, and you can contract with them to receive some of those funds back to the district. And we are not tax advisors, so obviously speak with tax professionals to ensure how this works and how you can do this. But again, you can utilize that deduction and sort of further lower your adjusted incremental cost. And now you might be able to say, okay, based on the energy savings alone, are we achieving a payback that we like on that adjusted incremental cost of roughly 2 million to 2.8 million? And if not, what are the additional benefits we're getting? Are we going to have more stable, space temperatures? Are we going to have better indoor air quality? Those are a little tougher to quantify, in some cases, but they can certainly help sort of make the case for these projects. And I would say you kind of do a similar version of this analysis with the investment tax credits. I see some chats happening about that. But you might need to focus on ground source heat pump versus air side, because ground source is the only kind of equipment that is allowed for heat pump technology within ITC. But if you're doing solar or wind or EV infrastructure, you can get some additional rebates for that as well through the ITC. So we will pass it on now to hear a great school district example from our good friend Chamberlain.
All right. Thanks, Shannon. So hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Chamberlain Seagrass, and I am the Sustainability Manager at Sacramento City Unified School District in North Central California. And I've actually been with the district since September of 2022. So, yep. So we serve approximately 40,000 students across 75 schools with about 90 buildings in our portfolio. The city of Sacramento is often included on lists identifying the most diverse cities in the country, and our student population definitely reflects this. Next slide. So we created a long-term facilities plan in 2021, and this plan outlines the modernization of all of our schools and facility buildings, many of which are over 60 years old. So traditionally, capital planning money focuses on facility needs, which is what you're looking at right now on this graph, and then also enrollment numbers. Next slide. However, this tends to perpetuate an unfair distribution of money within school districts. So more funding is given to affluent neighborhoods, which is coupled with further disinvestment in less affluent neighborhoods. And this prioritization then leads to school closures and historically marginalized communities, which leads to a growing distrust between the district and the communities who often rely on them the most. So the reason I'm talking about this is what kind of informed our facilities plan. And so as a facilities team, we knew we had to use this plan to intentionally disrupt the system. So next slide. So we actually got an equity consultant to help us on this, but they helped us think about how to reinvest our capital dollars into these communities. So this index that you're looking at combines student level data. It combines data like race and income and students with disabilities and emerging bilinguals with community level data like environmental and socioeconomic data. And that provides us with a ranking for each school and neighborhood so that we can compare and then prioritize funding based on need. So next slide. Yep. We also built a strong community engagement strategy into this process to ensure that what we are building really reflects the needs and the priorities of the communities that it is going to serve. Next slide. So we had a large steering committee providing feedback on the facilities plan, and they were very clear about the need to include sustainability efforts into our facilities planning program. So we were able to get funding through our local electric company to actually partner with NBI to help us create what would become our carbon neutral goals and guidelines, which I'm going to walk you through right now because that's kind of our first step, was creating these goals after the community engagement piece. So we created, back to the last one. So we created specific carbon neutral goals and guidelines for each type of facility project being done. So this is broken down, as you can see, into new construction, major mods, and then facility projects like HVAC replacements. Yep, next slide. So our big picture goal, and like you saw this in an earlier slide, is to be carbon neutral by 2045. This is in line with our state's goal of carbon neutrality as well. So in order to achieve this goal, we must electrify all of our natural gas assets, but we also need to reduce energy usage in each building. So we created intermediate energy consumption targets for 2030 and 2040, which you can see in blue. And then we also have target EUI goals, which expresses buildings' energy uses divided by its square footage. And so this way we can kind of compare our buildings' energy usage regardless of their size. Next slide. We also have project level EUI goals, depending on whether the project is, depending on what type of project it is. And there's a range here because our buildings, produce different levels. So our elementary schools tend to be on the lower end of the spectrum and our admin tend to be on the upper end. So next slide. So the goals I just described are the what. What do we want to achieve, and the guidelines help us plan how we are going to achieve these goals. So most of our guidelines relate to new builds and major modifications. We employ integrated design. We have an energy champion who can help make sure we're sticking to our EUI targets. But we also have standards and specifications that our design teams have to follow. So we're looking at, minimum insulation values and percent shading across schoolyards. So obviously, as we use these guidelines and specifications, we're going to continue to monitor and update them. It's a living document, right? So these technologies, these building codes, the price points, they're always evolving. So we need to be on top of our game as well. And these goals and guidelines are now embedded into our standards and specifications. So it's been said before, but decarbonization is a journey, right? And I kind of see us still sort of at the beginning of our journey. So we got our goals and guidelines officially approved by our board last October. But we've actually already put them to use. So I'm going to walk you through some of our decarbonization projects that came about after these goals were passed. They're mostly planned capital improvement projects, and they're paid for through bond funding and then IRA credits where applicable. So next slide. So our facilities team is very interested in using bond funding to help reduce general fund expenses in the future, like through reduced utility costs. So we're not doing anything revolutionary, but I'm going to walk you through some of our energy efficiency practices, because obviously those are the things that you need to focus on first. So we've recently updated our energy management system, so we can now see historical trends. So this really helps us, when we notice an increase in energy, we can now see perhaps what has been causing it by looking back at that data. We're also recommissioning all of our set points, and this is an easy thing that anyone can do, as they're very inconsistent across our buildings right now. So we're going to recommission them to a standard, the one in the middle of that table, but we're actually going to pilot the energy saving set points with a couple of schools, hoping to get feedback from them on their comfort and see if we can kind of push to the energy saving for our set points in the future at a lot of our schools. And then we also have added demand control ventilation to 23 schools, and we're currently reviewing that data for energy trends. So the image in the upper right is of 3 classrooms that are part of this pilot. So we can see real-time temperature and CO2 levels in each room. And if the CO2 levels reach kind of a predetermined threshold, the damper is going to open and it's going to pull in fresh air. And we're hoping that this will keep classrooms feeling less stuffy, so teachers will be less inclined to open windows throughout the day, and we'll see a reduction in energy consumption. And then obviously we're doing the standard, like we have solar projects on our bond list. We're continuing to retrofit LED. We've shut down our kitchens for the summer that aren't in use over the summer. And we're actually adding, one thing I'm really focusing on is adding more shade tree to our schoolyards, because this is, we'll keep students and staff cooler when they're outdoors so they feel less hot coming back inside. Obviously this is a big deal for California, specifically where I am in the Valley, but it'll also potentially reduce energy consumption in the building. Next slide. So we're also doing some electrification work as well. So we have 3 kitchen electrification pilots happening this summer. And this all came about because we passed those goals and guidelines. And they're a first, so it's really exciting. They're only going to touch the cooking equipment. So the water heaters were not a part of these projects because either they were new or newer, or that water was heating more than just the kitchen and it was a bigger project than we were ready for. So we're adding, as you can see, an electric combi oven, a griddle, and an induction range at each site. And we're going obviously from gas to electric for this equipment. But luckily we only had to upgrade panel capacity at one of these 3 schools. The other ones had plenty of capacity, which was a big cost saver. And then our biggest lesson learned is that we, the combi oven that our nutrition service director had spec'd was much bigger than our old convention oven. So it required a larger hood, which then triggered roof restructuring. And so the cost just kind of ballooned from there. So we're now obviously going back and working with a nutrition services director to find an equivalent like for like size replacement to avoid triggering our Division of State Architects or DSA in the future. Next slide. And then we're also electrifying some HVAC at one of our elementary schools that is up for a major campus renewal. So the current HVAC system at this school actually presented an interesting challenge that led us on top of our goals and guidelines to really consider electrification. So this school is actually what we call one of our finger schools, which just means it has these, you can kind of see it on this map, right? It has these long classrooms kind of back to back to back, kind of 3 or more of these long rows of classrooms that each individually open up to courtyards that are like hallways. And then many of our elementary schools have a very similar footprint. And each classroom in this school has a very noisy furnace that is installed in a closet in the classroom, which takes up meaningful square footage from those students. And it also causes a lot of noise. So we have some noise pollution going on. And then additionally, the rooms are cooled with AC units in the windows. So because, and I think someone mentioned, I think it was Reese who was talking about this earlier, but because the HVAC units are currently on the ground, the roof would not have supported individual rooftop units, and we would have had to reinforce the entire roof, which would have cost a lot of money. And we also wanted to remove those units from the closet and give back that meaningful square footage to each classroom. So next slide. So our solution right now is we are currently in the design phase for a variable refrigerant flow or VRF system at that school. And our reasoning behind this is that the condensing units, which you can see in that photo on the right, will be secluded to just one area of the roof. So we will only need to reinforce that one area, which will save us money. It's very quiet because the condensing units are outside. And then the fan coils, which the refrigerant is piped to in each classroom, are also very quiet. So we're going to see noise reduction. We'll be able to get those closets back and expand classroom space by getting rid of those furnaces. And we're using bond money to install this. So we're not pulling from the general fund. And this is very energy efficient. So we're replacing old unenergy efficient equipment, which means that we'll be saving on utility costs every year, which does come from the general fund. So we're going to be see savings for the students year after year. The challenges of a VRF system, you may know, there's a lot of refrigerant involved because the refrigerant is pumped to each room to either heat or cool the classroom through a fan coil in the ceiling. So we're dealing with a lot of refrigerant running throughout the building, which is a greenhouse gas. Obviously, there are different refrigerants and they have different levels of global warming potential. So we're working with our design team to get on the lower end of that spectrum. But they can also all leak. So that is something that everyone needs to be aware of when they're installing these. And we are hoping that this pilot is a success and that we can use it at some of our other similar sized schools that have the same footprint. So that's kind of a window into our current decarb journey, kind of where we've gone since the community engagement and goals and guidelines. And we'll continue to fund decarbonization through our capital improvement projects. We actually have 4 new builds coming up and 1 major modernization. So those are all obviously bond funded and will be all electric and energy efficient. And we're going to just continue to track our progress and ensure that we're staying on track to meet our intermediate and final goals. So thank you all so much for listening. I'll just pass it on for questions, I believe.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chamberlain. And thank you so much to all of the presenters. That was a whirlwind of information. Oh my gosh, so much great info. I'm going to stop my screen share. We have 10 minutes left for some questions, and there are a few questions in the Q&A box. I saw there was a few in the chat as well, so we'll try to note those if we can, but if you're able to put them in the Q&A, it's very helpful. So I wanted to first queue up, there was a couple different questions about the IRA, about the funding that we talked about. You know, does it give, so one of the questions is, does the IRA give the rebate or refund or the 30% kind of discount for ground source heat pumps, but not for air source heat pumps? And then there was another question, I believe, about, I'm going to just read it here. Yeah, how can you basically get the funds to the school without involving another organization? So I think maybe Shannon, if you could kind of clarify that difference between the 179D and the ITC, and then kind of talk a little bit about the heat pump side of things.
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, definitely. So to the question regarding involving the for-profit folks, so the example we're talking about here today specifically was about the 179D program, which is a tax refund. Essentially, it reduces the tax burden for entities that pay taxes, right? Which schools obviously do not. But the recent changes allow for some of that tax refund to go back to the school. And that's kind of an amount you need to negotiate with your contractor. So that you do have to have, it does need to go through that for-profit entity for the 179D. The investment tax credits are a different program. This is a direct pay rebate, essentially, that will come back to the school. Does not require a middleman as far as the movement of funds. Will probably require your contractor for some of the information you're going to need to submit. But those are, so yeah, those are a little bit different. And then as far as the heat pump, yes, currently the investment tax credit at the federal level does only provide that tax rebate for ground source heat pump. Not sure why we didn't make the rules necessarily. I think perhaps as they were developing these policies, maybe they were unsure about, you know, air source heat pump application in some environments, or who knows exactly why, but that is the case. So if you are looking at air source heat pumps, you may need to check locally or regionally, perhaps with your utility provider. I know some states include those in their programs, so you may need to look for some other sources to help fund those projects.
Thanks, Shannon. Thanks for clarifying that. And while we're talking about funding, Chamberlain, there was a question about the funding sources on your projects. You mentioned the projects were bond funded. The question is, are these loans? Did you tap into IRA and other funding sources like green banks, or is that something you've thought about or explored?
Yes, we will definitely tap into the RNA. So our IRA, you can get, even with bond funded money, which oftentimes is not, you can still use the IRA. So we're definitely going to tap into that. I think it'll be something like because we're not paying taxes on it, we'll get like 27% back instead of 30. It's some sort of haircut there on the percentage. But we will definitely utilize the IRA where we can in all of our projects. So it's sort of a coupling of bond funding with IRA. And no, I have not looked at the green banks, but that's something to look into. So thanks.
Thanks, Chamberlain. And while we have you talking, there's one more question for you about the VRF system. The question is, do teachers get to turn off systems for each room by going with the VRF?
That's a great question. Yeah, so we're always looking at, you know, the trying to find that middle ground between comfort and energy savings, right? And if you give total control to the teachers, sometimes you'll get you'll see a great reduction in energy efficiency. So yeah, we're trying to find that middle ground. So I am assuming that we'll stick with kind of we'll set the set points in those classrooms, and then they'll get a plus or minus certain degree. So I think it's plus or minus 3. So we have our set points, and then they can go up or down by 3 degrees. But we're always working directly with each school to try and make sure that, you know, comfort's a priority, student learning is our priority.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Chamberlain. Always bringing it back to the occupant comfort. That's great. since we are talking about the HVAC, Reese, I know that you had answered a question in the chat or in the Q&A box, but I would love to kind of just give a high level just for the recording's sake for folks that are watching this after the fact. The question is, are there any recommendations or best practices for evaluating envelope improvements before HVAC updates? Because that can, help reduce the sizing requirements and improve the air quality and resiliency. So I just was, if you wouldn't mind just kind of recapping what you shared in the Q&A, that would be great.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's definitely a benefit to, staging your retrofit and doing the envelope upgrades first, if you have the budget for that. And envelope retrofits can be a very involved, lengthy, and expensive process. So there are ways to focus on kind of the key, high impact, lower cost measures like window retrofits, air sealing. I think Rick put in there also a good one is shading, and that was something I believe Chamberlain mentioned, but and roof reflectiveness. And then something I did want to mention is as you start to get a tighter envelope in your building, which is great for efficiency benefits, you're also trapping whatever air is in there a lot better than you were previously. So that's when active ventilation really comes in handy, and that's really what we want to encourage folks to retrofit their ventilation systems and not just replace a gas furnace with a wall heat pump. So just wanted to mention that.
Great, thanks, Reese. We have one other question that would love to hear just from whoever would like to tackle this answer. What steps do you recommend to ensure the utility companies can support additional electrical load, base load in their communities and commit to upgrade their electrical grid, knowing that, as we electrify things, that's, creating more load or, base electric load. Any recommendations related to that?
I can make a first pass, and then I feel like we can add here. Depending on your role sort of in the world, like let's use a school district, for example, here, creating, and we hear this from school districts a lot, that creating that relationship, like a true and authentic relationship with your utility provider and your sort of commercial contact is a really great way to establish like a really solid relationship. We heard from a district recently that oftentimes utility providers only hear from the district when it's that emergency situation. So that's not a great relationship. So creating that relationship with your utility provider, so your direct customer contact, and giving those kinds of recommendations, asking questions, just making sure that you're constantly sort of like interacting with them in a way to make sure that they can get the grid or wherever their sort of like trajectory is going. So creating a relationship is where I'm going to start with that. And you could be a school district, you could be a residential customer, you could be a designer, you can pretty much be anybody, but just remember that those utilities often only hear from their customers when it's an emergency. So that is a great way to establish like a really good relationship to move things forward and get a good understanding of what they can provide for you. Anyone else?
I can just add on to that and say, yes, Riley took the words out of my mouth. Establish a relationship, meet with your, the person who oversees your accounts, build that relationship. And now, I live in Sacramento, so we have we have SMUDS, the Sacramento Municipal Utility. So it's a smaller electric company, so it might be easier to build that relationship. But one thing I found is that we're trying to build like this reciprocity partnership, right? So they know that we need more capacity from them if we're going to fully electrify. But we know that we have a lot of land and they are looking to diversify their portfolio by getting, they have a goal of like all renewable by 2030. So we've been meeting a lot around using some of our parking lots around, putting in solar for community solar for SMUD. So you can think of it, trying to find kind of a two-way partnership as well as one thing that we've done.
Great. Well, I know we are right at time, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. There are a couple more kind of in the weeds questions in the Q&A related to HVAC refrigerant rules, and Chamberlain, for you, did you make a conscious decision to avoid heat pump systems using water as the working fluid, and questions about additional work needed to prep the buildings for the new HVAC system, like updating electrical and things like that. So maybe we can, I think typically what we do in this situation is just answer those questions offline and make those answers available. So we'll do that after the fact here. And as I mentioned, the slides will be made available as well as the recording. And just want to say thank you again to everyone, to all of our panelists. It's a great session and really appreciate your time today and everyone who joined us as well. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.